Daniel Voss was 41 years old, and by 5:40 in the morning, he had already done the only arithmetic that mattered to him. $214.37 in the account, $3,180 owed for the inhalers that kept his daughter breathing through Montana winters. The depot garage held on to the night's cold like a debt of its own. Motor oil gone thick and sour in the low temperature, concrete that hadn't fully dried since November, the walls damp with a chill the boiler never quite reached before shift change. He kept his jacket zipped to the throat. The badge on the lanyard around his neck was orange. Down the hall, past the vending machines, the staff engineers wore blue. And blue meant a break room that actually held heat, coffee that wasn't instant, and a kind of laughter that only came from people who weren't counting anything. Quiet. Someone in there was talking about a bonus. He could hear the number through the wall and didn't try to make it out. His contract ran 90 days, the way it always had, the way every orange badges did, and the depot had never once carried one past that mark, not because the work dried up, but because renewal meant a line item somebody upstairs would rather not explain in a budget meeting. He understood the arithmetic of that too. In his truck, under the driver's seat, sat a canvas tool roll gone dark and soft with age, one seam hand-stitched with the initials RV. He touched it every morning before his shift, the way another man might touch something around his neck, though he had never once opened the inner pocket sewn along its spine. He had built an entire life around not needing to know what was in it. Nobody asked a mechanic what he thought. They asked him to hurry, and he had gotten good enough at hurrying that most people stopped noticing. He'd quietly stopped expecting to be asked at all. He didn't resent it. He simply built his mornings quietly around it, unmoved. His supervisor found him at the workbench a little after 7 and didn't sit down before he spoke, which told Daniel most of what he needed to know before the sentence finished. 50 engineers had failed to solve whatever was wrong with the Sentinel-9 prototype. By end of day, the program needed a warm body on the overnight crew. They weren't asking him. They were sending him. The conference room smelled of cedar cologne before it smelled of anything else. A scent applied with the confidence of a man who had never once wondered if a room could hold too much of him. The glass walls kept the cold out and the noise in. Table of staff engineers with champagne flutes disguised as sparkling water that had been announced 20 minutes earlier at $340 million. Oh. Dr. Preston Ashcombe stood at the head of a Rolex catching the fluorescent light. Every time he lifted his glass, his jacket cut close enough and priced high enough. $1,900, though no one in the room would have guessed a figure that specific. That it moved with him rather than around him. He saw Daniel's badge before he saw Daniel, orange. His expression didn't change so much as settle, the way a man's face settles when he's decided something requires no further thought. Ah, he said, not quite to Daniel, not quite to the room, the overnight solution. Someone laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly, which was what made it land the way it did. Ashcombe crossed to a side table and returned with a cardboard box, its flaps stamped Condiment Disposal in red block letters, and set it in Daniel's hands the way a man hands off something he's already forgotten. Inside, unlogged, unlabeled, sat the scrap pulled from the failed vehicle over 11 days of testing, including one corroded control module nobody had bothered to write down on any inventory sheet at all. "We don't need someone who fixes trucks, Mr. Voss," Ashcombe said, and he said it lightly, almost kindly, the way a man corrects a child he doesn't dislike. "We need someone who understands systems. But sure, take the box, somebody should." The toast continued behind him. Champagne caught the light at the same table where Daniel signed the disposal form, and no one in that room noticed the coincidence of timing, his silence rising up to meet their laughter, both belonging to the same 3 seconds. He didn't argue. He carried the box out himself, past the blue badges, out into a parking lot lit orange by a single working sodium lamp. The modules was heavier than it looked, just under 4 pounds, its brass fittings gone green with corrosion. He turned it over out of nothing more than habit. The same habit that made him check a torque spec twice, and found a scratch pattern along the casing he'd first taken for damage. It wasn't damage, it was letters. RV. Took. His father had been dead for years. This had been built 2 generations after him. 340 miles north, The highway stopped pretending it belonged to anyone. Daniel put the gas on a card that was already carrying more than it should, and skipped lunch, then skipped dinner. Because the myth only worked if the return trip cost him nothing he hadn't already accounted for. He didn't think of it as sacrifice. He thought of it as arithmetic, the same way he thought of everything. Cold Bay 7 announced itself before he saw it. Stale diesel first, old and settled into the walls the way a smell settles into a garage that's never properly aired out, and beneath it the flat mineral scent of frost that hadn't melted in weeks. The building held a silence that wasn't peace so much as neglect. The heat had been shut off to save budget, and the cold inside was worse than the cold outside because it had nowhere to go. His boots on the concrete were the only sound in the entire hangar. Then the visual arrived. Last, the way it was supposed to. The Sentinel-9 sat gutted under work lights nobody had bothered to turn off. Panels stripped and stacked in loose, careless piles, wiring left hanging where someone had given up mid-thought rather than mid-task. 11 days of failed diagnosis looked exactly like this, not a mystery, but an abandonment. He stood beside it for a long moment, close enough to feel how much larger it was than him, and considered leaving. He had no clearance to touch government hardware without supervision. If someone found him here alone, it wouldn't cost him this contract. It would cost him every contract after it, on every base, for the rest of whatever career he had left. He thought about his daughter's inhaler bill. He thought about turning around. He didn't. His father had never once walked away from a problem half seen, and Daniel had spent his whole life being the kind of man who didn't either, whether or not anyone was there to notice. He climbed up into the cab. On the dead dashboard, a single gauge was ticking upward, fraction by fraction. Though the ignition had been off for 6 hours, and the batteries, according to the disposal log in his pocket, had been pulled 2 full days ago. Something was still drawing were. He traced the wiring back to the panel behind it, expecting a factory seam. Instead, he found a weld, rough, recent, done in a hurry by someone who hadn't wanted it found. The gauge answered before Daniel touched anything. He traced the wiring by hand, wrist deep in cold metal, and confirmed what he already suspected. Every fraction of that ticking climb ran straight back to the panel behind the weld, to a compartment that drew power it had no factory reason to draw. He got the cordless grinder from his father's tool roll, the only tool in it he'd ever needed before tonight, and cut the weld away in short, careful passes, sparks scattering orange across the dark hull. Beneath it sat a second compartment, smaller than the first, hand-cut, absent from every schematic he'd ever studied. Not factory work. Someone had built this space on purpose and hidden the fact of it just as deliberately the door resisted him. Rust had sealed the hinge shut, and he worked it for 11 full minutes with a flat bar and patience that had never once failed him, easing it a fraction at a time rather than forcing what wasn't ready to give. When it finally opened, it did so all at once. With a groan, that sound was almost vehicle hardware. It was a sealed metal tin, cold under his palm, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, a journal, bound in the same stitching as the tool roll under his arm. He knew the hand before he opened the cover. He had grown up watching it fill out invoices at the kitchen table. He read by flashlight, the beam narrow and steady against the page, the smell of old paper and cold metal rising together in the small space he'd carved open. His father, Robert Voss, had spent 3 months in the winter of 1953 chasing an identical bleed through the electrical systems of the M4A3E8 tanks his unit ran in Korea. A fault that caused catastrophic ignition failure in cold weather, the exact failure that had beaten 50 engineers on this exact program 73 years later. Army supply had no replacement part for 6 weeks. His father hadn't waited for one. He'd built a capacitor bridge from scavenged components, logged the fix in careful handwriting, and never once mentioned it to anyone who outranked him. The entry didn't read like a confession. It read like a man leaving instructions for someone he trusted to need them. He named the part. He explained the sequence. He wrote that the Army had a way of rewarding the men who filed the right paperwork and forgetting the ones who actually kept the tanks running, and that Daniel, whoever he turned out to be, should never mistake one for the other. The last line wasn't sentimental, it was earned. The men who mattered were the ones who stayed after everyone else gave up, Daniel didn't move for a long moment. He didn't need to. His body had already gone still in the particular way it went still when something required all of him at once, and his mind, without asking permission, ran the number anyway. A fix ignored for 73 years, sitting in his hands, worth more to this program tonight than everything Ashcomb's team had built across 11 days of failure. Headlights swept across the far wall of the hangar, white and sudden. He checked his watch. 11:40. Someone else was here. The badge scan alert had gone out the moment Daniel cleared the hangar's outer door, which meant someone had been watching that entrance long before tonight. A detail Ashcombe never intended to reveal and never quite managed to hide. He arrived with a security officer half a step behind him, his coat thrown on over pajama pants, and the fact that he'd left his house at all told Daniel more about how much this failure actually mattered than anything said in the glass conference room that morning. Mr. Voss. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Orange badge contractors aren't authorized to access sealed government engineering sign-off. You understand that. It wasn't a question, and Daniel didn't treat it as one. I can terminate this contract tonight. I can terminate this contract tonight. Ashcombe continued, in this register a man might use to read a weather report. And I can make sure the file note follows you to every base you ever try to work on again. I'd rather not, but I will. He said it like policy. That was what made it land the way it did. Not cruelty, just procedure. Delivered by a man who had never once had to imagine what it cost someone else. Somewhere above eastern Montana, General Marsh Calloway's aircraft was already in the air. 6 hours and 11 minutes from now, it would touch down for a program review that would decide, in a single meeting, whether Sentinel-9 was canceled outright. Daniel set the journal down. He closed the tin without hurrying, the way a man closes something he intends to open again, and asked one question, quiet, specific, almost incidental, about a capacitor bridge built from scavenged parts. Ashcombe barely glanced at the tin. Scrapyard nonsense, he said, already turning toward the door, already finished with the conversation in his own mind. We're not running a junkyard operation here, Mr. Voss. We're running an engineering program. He didn't know what he'd just described. Nobody in the hangar did, except the one man he'd already decided didn't understand systems. Ashcombe nodded to the security officer, and the officer's hand found Daniel's shoulder. Not rough, just final. The hangar door came down behind them with a long mechanical groan. Sealed for the morning review, the vehicle still broken on the other side of it. Daniel stood in the cold outside, the tin heavy in his coat pocket, and did the only math that had ever mattered to him, 6 hours and 11 minutes. He knew exactly what he had to do before that plane landed. Daniel didn't drive home. He waited at the perimeter fence with the tin still in his coat pocket, and when the depot foreman pulled in for the morning shift, headlights cutting through the last of the dark, Daniel was already walking toward the gate. He didn't ask permission so much as explain, plainly and without embellishment. Without embellishment, what he'd found and what it meant. The foreman had known Robert Voss's name before he'd ever known Daniel's, had served 2 years under men who still talked about him, and it took less convincing than Daniel expected. 11 minutes before General Calloway's convoy was due, the gate opened. Inside, Daniel worked fast but never careless, the way his father's handwriting had taught him to work decades before either of them knew it. He built the capacitor bridge exactly as the journal described it, sourcing the one part that couldn't be ordered from the box marked condemned. The same box Ashcombe had handed him as an insult, now sitting open on the workbench, doing the only useful thing it had done in 11 days. He had the panel closed and the tools put away before the convoy's engines were audible. Calloway's team walked into the hangar mid-sentence, already discussing cancellation, and Ashcombe met them at the door with the composure of a man certain the morning belonged to him. Calloway asked, without much ceremony, who had solved what 50 engineers hadn't been able to touch. Ashcombe opened his mouth to answer. The engine the morning caught clean. On the first try, no hesitation, no stutter. The sound filling the hangar the way silence had filled it for 11 days. Ashcombe's mouth was still open. He reached, instinctively for the moment, the way a man reaches for something falling off a table. Before he's decided whether it's his to catch, he never got there. Daniel set the journal on the table between them, and beside it, The security log the foreman had pulled overnight. Ashcomb's own voice on record from less than 12 hours earlier, dismissing a capacitor bridge as scrapyard nonsense. In the exact minute the fix was sitting a box, he'd condemned himself. Calloway read both without speaking. The room read Calloway's face instead. Ashcomb's composure didn't crack so much as evaporate. The same certainty that had handed a mechanic a box of scrap, now failing to produce a single sentence in his own defense, while Daniel stood beside him unmoved, hands still faintly smelling of solder, saying nothing at all, until Calloway looked at him directly and asked him to. "You said you needed someone who understands systems," Daniel said, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear it. Final enough that no one needed to ask him to repeat it. "Turns out you just needed someone who reads." No one laughed this time. Calloway turned to his aide before the sentence had fully settled, and ordered an immediate audit of every test log Ashcomb's team had filed since the failure began. A beginning, not an ending, but the kind of beginning that doesn't reverse itself. Daniel walked out of the hangar into full daylight. For the first time in 11 days, his father's tool rolled back over his shoulder, the door standing open behind him. The audit took 9 days. It found what the security log had already suggested. 2 falsified test reports, filed to hide the original defect and protect a funding timeline that Ashcombe had staked his name to before he understood what the defect actually was. He was terminated within the week, barred from federal contracting for 5 years. The falsification referred to a formal ethics review that would follow him into every room he tried to enter afterward. No one wrote a headline about it. It simply closed, the way a door closes when there's nothing left to say. Daniel was offered a permanent staff position, lead field diagnostic advisor for the Sentinel-9 program, and the backdated pay cleared his daughter's $3,180 medical bill before the end of the month, with enough left over that he stopped checking his account balance every morning for the first time in over a year. 18 months later, the sign above a small bay on Route 9 read Voss and Daughter, hand-painted, not printed. Inside, Daniel trained technicians the depot had never bothered to notice, men and women without degrees, without blue badges, who had spent years being handed the boxes nobody else wanted. He taught them the way his father had taught him without ever meaning to. Through his hands, not his paperwork. In the early morning before customers, he stood in the open bay doorway and let the light in. It wasn't fluorescent anymore. It was sunrise, full in gold across the concrete, warming a floor that had never once been cold in the way that garage and the depot had been cold. Behind the register, framed now, instead of hidden under a truck seat, hung a canvas tool roll stitched by hand along one seam with the initials RV. No longer something he touched out of habit before a shift, but something every technician who worked for him saw first, every single morning, before they picked up a single tool. Nobody had ever put his father's name on a blueprint, but every engine that starts on a cold morning still runs, somewhere underneath it, on what a mechanic knew, and eventually, on what a general finally saw.